Hello, Oasis. Hey. Hey, we are in week 2 of our series, Secrets of the Kingdom. Tonight we're going to be in Matthew 22. We're looking at another parable of Jesus. And the parables are teaching devices that Jesus used to reveal deep spiritual truths. But before we dive into the text, I gotta know, who got to sit at the kids' table this Thanksgiving? Okay, you guys are my people. You see, my grandparents' house is like very, very small, and I have a lot of cousins, and so for my entire life, there's been like the actual dining table that all the adults sit at, and there's been this back room that all the cousins have just grown up sitting at. The problem is that most of my cousins are now older than me, so I'm 24, and I have another cousin that's 24, and we're hanging out with all of our other middle school cousins, and we're like eating turkey, and I'm getting creamed playing Apples to Apples Jr. with a 12-year-old. Like, she annihilated me. But there came this point at Thanksgiving where my middle school cousin decided that she would like to inform the entire family that the only way you get to graduate to the adult table is if you're married or if you're 35. And so I have, if I do the math correctly, I think I have another 10 Thanksgivings in that back room. Man, but that one hit really hard over there. But there's always like this special moment coming with family, like when you share stories and when you get to be together after you've been away for a while. And as I was home with my parents, we were talking about 2 of my grandparents that aren't here anymore. A couple years ago, my great-grandmother passed away. She was 100 years old. And then a few months later, my grandpa passed away. And man, when my great-grandma turned 90, this phase in her life started to kick in where she thought that everything was gonna be her last moment. And so she wanted to host and to plan every single family dinner, every single family meal. And so we let her because we wanted to allow her to have that intentionality with us. But this thing happens when you turn 90. Your body does not function when you're 20, when you're 90, like it just makes sense. And so at this point in her life, she had lost most of her hearing, most of her vision. She had lost her ability to taste. She couldn't really feel textures. She couldn't really smell. And so when you think about all those things combined and that she's gonna make you a really nice meal, it's not gonna go well. And for the most part, we show up to her house. For the most part, everything is great, and we're getting the table set, and we're getting ready to eat. And my grandpa, who's passed, we call him Papa Clyde. Papa Clyde is very loud. He has a very big personality, and he was a really, really cool guy. But he always had this unspoken ritual that no matter what anybody cooked, he would always compliment the chef in this incredibly loud voice, and he would always state their name. So we called her Mildred. He'd go, "Mildred, this is your best do ever." Every single meal with Papa Clyde started with this statement, and we're looking at the mashed potatoes and gravy. They are getting passed around, and man, the gravy was thicker than the mashed potatoes, and Papa Clyde is saying, "This is your best do ever," and it was not. But over time, as my grandma got older, and we kind of realized that her time was coming, she increased her intentionality. It became not as much about hosting, but it became more about sharing stories from her life. There were actually stories that she hadn't shared with anybody for over 80 years. She was born in 1919, and her family had a covered wagon, and the kids weren't allowed to play on the covered wagon, but one day her parents went on a trip, and she and her siblings started playing on this covered wagon, and she got run over by one of the wheels. And she didn't tell her parents about it. She didn't tell anybody about it, and she's like 98 years old, and she's telling us this, and she's kept this secret for 80 years. But something happens when people get close to the end. They increase their intentionality in how they host and how they sit and in what they talk about. And as we look in Matthew 22 tonight, Jesus is doing the same thing. You see, this is actually a parable of Jesus is speaking the Tuesday before he is crucified on a Friday. Jesus is speaking in the middle of what we now call Holy Week. Holy Week is the period of time between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday. It starts Palm Sunday with this triumphal entry. Jesus is riding in on a donkey, and the crowds are proclaiming, they're saying, "Hosanna." They're saying, "God save us." And it's this incredible moment where you feel like God's people finally get it. You feel like they're like, man, he's the Messiah. And Jesus goes into the temple on Monday, and he starts clearing out the abuse the money changers are doing. They are trying to get people to pay more than what they actually need to. And Jesus clears it out. And on Tuesday, he returns to the temple, and the religious leaders are accusing him, and they are questioning his authority. And so he is giving his last few parables. Yet on Wednesday, he will be betrayed by his disciple Judas. On Thursday, he will host the Last Supper. He will institute what we now call communion. He will take his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, while he will fervently pray to the point where he is sweating drops of blood, and after he is done, he will be arrested. On Friday, he will be tried, and the same people that were proclaiming, Hosanna, God save us, are the same people that are now screaming and saying, crucify him. And on that Friday, he gives up his life for us. So when we hear that Jesus is teaching this parable on the Tuesday of Holy Week, this is no accident. This is not just your random Tuesday at your grandparents' house. This is the Tuesday where everything matters. These parables are directly speaking to systems of religious abuse that religious leaders have created and sustained, and they are proclaiming this one main idea. They're proclaiming the main idea of grace. And at the end of the day, the religious leaders are so frustrated by a kingdom of grace. We read later in Matthew 26 that the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. This leads us to ask the question, what did Jesus say, and why was it so offensive? And so tonight we're going to start by reading the entirety of this parable, and then we're going to break it down section by section. And so if you have your Bibles, I invite you to join me in Matthew 22, starting in verse 1. Jesus spoke to them again in parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, 'How did you get in here without wearing wedding clothes, friend?' The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are invited, but few are chosen.'" That might be the craziest wedding I've ever heard of. There's something going on here. And I think we need to read the entirety of it first, because Jesus is inviting us to sit in attention. He's inviting us to see the good news of his grace. He's also inviting us to see this tension of darkness and destruction, and we're asked tonight to hold both of them together. The depth of what Jesus is illustrating is found when we sit in this for a while. And tonight, our big idea is that we get the daily grace, we get the daily choice to live in God's grace. And as Jesus is preaching this story to the religious leaders, he's inviting them into a new way of life. A life that is not about work, and not about achievement, but a life that is about a grace that has been freely given to you through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so let's break it down, and we're going to start with the intro. We're going to start with the first 3 verses. We read that Jesus spoke to them again in parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come." Within these first 3 verses, Jesus is actually retelling the entire narrative of the Old Testament. You see, the king represents God the Father, the Son represents Jesus Christ the Son, and the guests here, they represent the people that miss God's calling. And so what God does is that when we look at the Old Testament, I have a graphic here that can maybe help us. This is a graphic on the left side. This is how all of the books in your Bible are categorized. You see, when God created the world, he created a group of people, and he created a nation called Israel. And he said, "Look, I'm going to choose you to be a nation that leads other nations to know me." So these first 5 books of the Bible, we call them the law, because it's the story of how God establishes this covenant promise with Israel, that no matter what Israel does, God will always remain faithful. Yet God extends his grace by giving them an outline of how they're called to live. So he doesn't just say, follow me. He then gives them a way that they can follow him. And the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, it explains all of this. But as we keep going and as we keep reading the story of Israel, we see that this gets challenging. It leads us to the second section in purple. We call them our historical books. These historical books tell us everything from like the promised land up until like the very, very beginning of the New Testament. It tells us the history of different kings that ruled, how Israel went through seasons of exile, and it really honestly shows us this repeated cycle of what happens with God's people. There's this moment in which they're like, man, God is so good. They worship him great, but over time they start looking at the people around them, and they start to take a little bit from here, a little bit from there. And suddenly, their worship is completely corrupted. Suddenly, they have completely forgotten who God is. And they are doing some pretty detestable things, some pretty vile and wicked things. And God, in his grace, he will look down and he say, I don't like this for my people because I created them for more. So as the historical books are playing out, God then sends people called messengers, and we call them the prophets. This is that orange section. And so as the historical books are going out, your major and minor prophets in the Bible, they are weaving through. And the prophets are messengers that come to do 2 things. The first thing that they do is they call out what God's people are doing. They say, God's not blind. He actually sees that you've turned away from him, and it grieves his heart. But the second thing that they do is that the prophets remind God's people of God's covenant promise. They'll say, look, remember when God chose you? When he called you to be holy and blameless? God's not forgotten that. You're not too far gone, and God has a way. He is making a way right now for you to be the people he has called you to be. But when we read this parable, we read that the people didn't listen to the messengers. They refused this invitation. And this is the story of the Old Testament, and this is how Jesus begins diagnosing the heart condition of the religious leaders, because as Jesus keeps sharing this parable, he reveals that God gives people the choice of how they respond to his grace. God extends the invitation. God will invite you to more, but he doesn't force you into it. God extends the invitation to his people, but they get the choice of how they respond. And we see this clearly if we look back in verse 4. It says, then he, the king, sent some more servants and said, tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged, and he sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Jesus is illustrating here the usual response people have to the prophets. And the first one is what I kind of like to call complacency. It's people that make excuses to not show up. It's kind of like, okay, I'm an introvert, and I am guilty of this, but if you have any introverted friends, and like you invite them to like go have a game night at your house, and like, dude, I have a final coming up. It's like May of 2028, and I kind of need to study for it. Or like, man, like I have a really big project coming up in work, and you know when you invite them that they have nothing going on, but they still just don't want to come. This is the people that Jesus is talking about. It sounds like they have a good excuse. It sounds like they have something going on at work. It sounds like they have to go take care of their field, but they don't. You see, this invitation has been available for a while. They don't actually have anything they need to be doing. And the second group of people are those who are so frustrated by the noise of the prophets that they'll just silence them. They will oppress them, they will torture them to try and get them to stop talking, and if they keep talking, they will kill them. It's like if you have a dog, and like your dog's barking at you because it needs to go outside. Instead of letting your dog go outside, you just take it to the humane shelter, so that way you like don't ever have to hear it anymore. Like this is what's going on. They just want the noise to stop. They don't want to address the root problem. They just want to find a way to get the chaos to stop. And Jesus is calling this out. The prophets are calling God's people to more, but people frequently miss it because they can't hear or because they want to silence them and they are offended by the news. Yet in this parable, the king, he has prepared a banquet of honor. Oh my goodness, think about if you were invited to like the royal wedding. Like in England, Oh my goodness. Like only the best of the best people are invited to that. Only the people who have the right connections are invited to that. And when you show up to it, they don't just pull out like the McDonald's $5 value meal. They pull out like the best of the best. They pull out the best meat. Oh man, they pull out, guys, I bet they pull out mashed potatoes and gravy that are like the right consistency. They pull out the best. And Jesus is saying that this king has prepared a feast. It is the best. And it is ready. You don't even have to wait. It is available. And these people have known about it for months. They got an invitation in the mail. It's been blocked off on their calendar. But when the day of the wedding comes, they make bogus excuses or refuse to come. And Jesus is addressing this in the religious leaders. You see, the religious leaders were so afraid of what would happen if God's people happened to disobey again, that they created a religious system that was pretty rough to follow. They saw what happened when they disobeyed God. They saw what happened when they repeatedly turned to the practices that were around them. And they said, what if we just find a way to keep us from sinning? If we can just stop sinning, if we can manage it on our own, we'll be okay. And so they create these elaborate structures and processes, and religion and following the way of God honestly turns into like how you do your taxes. You don't know how to do them, and you just hope you did them right and that you don't get like thrown in jail or fined. Like this is what worship became. It became confusing. It became complex. But the religious leaders, they knew how the system worked. And so in their eyes, they were able to rise to this level where they believed that they were better than everybody else. They were able to follow the weird rules and stuff because they knew them and they created them. They built and sustained a system of abuse. And the religious leaders believed that they were saving themselves and saving God's people from sin. They stepped into spiritual pride because they thought they could use their intellect and their willpower to keep themselves from sinning. Yet in orchestrating and creating this system, they completely missed the message of God's grace. In orchestrating this, they completely missed the divine purpose of Jesus Christ. And so as Jesus stands in front of them, as Jesus has ministered in front of them for years, and has taught in front of them for years, every single time they have missed it because they were so focused on how their spiritual pride elevated them. They missed the grace of Jesus coming down to earth to pay a penalty and to pay the price that we couldn't pay. They missed the grace that Jesus sends his Spirit to empower us to live the life we are called to live. They missed the grace that Jesus is declaring the kingdom of God is here and it is now. Jesus came to announce the arrival of a kingdom of grace. And we keep reading in verse 8. The king then said to his servants, "The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find." So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. You see, this wedding banquet, it symbolizes a continual feast of delighting and communing with the living God himself. And what's beautiful about this invitation is that it's freely given to anybody. It's given to the good and it's given to the bad. The invitation is not earned, but it is given. No matter who you are, no matter what you've done, there's an opportunity for you to attend. You are called worthy. Yet the king will go to whatever lengths necessary to fill this place because that is his desire, to have a place where he can commune and delight with his people. And this goes directly against the system of the religious leaders. The religious leaders created a system where you have to prove your obedience. You have to prove your worthiness by perfection. You have to somehow manage to spiritually arrive in order to earn the invitation. But grace proclaims something different. Grace says that you are already worthy because you were created by the living God himself. This is a kingdom that is given and is not earned. And this kingdom is open and available because of grace and grace alone. Yet the problem is, as we keep reading, we see that some people maybe take advantage of this. Yes, grace is an invitation that is freely extended to us, but grace also requires something from us. If we read in verse 11, it says, "When the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, "How did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend?" The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, "Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are invited, but few are chosen." Jesus has spent his time proclaiming a kingdom of grace against the kingdom of works. But now he's transitioning to proclaim a kingdom of grace against a kingdom of spiritual complacency. You see, grace is more than an endless well that covers our offenses, but a daily reality that we are called to live in. I realized that was a mouthful, so I want to illustrate it real quick. When I was home, I went through some of my things. This is my soccer jersey. I played travel soccer for a bit. I was on a team called Storm Blue. Sorry, our name was Storm White, but our primary color was blue. Don't ask me how that worked. But when we show up to games, this is what we would wear. The problem is, do you know what color every other soccer team is? Blue, okay? So we had this backup jersey. So what would happen is a ref would basically choose what team would have to change, and depending on if you were that team, you'd have to go change into your backup jersey. So imagine if you're playing a game like an hour and a half from your house, and you have to change, and you are digging through your bag, frantically looking, and you don't got this one. Everybody else on your team does, but this is the one that is missing. You are calling your mom, you're like, "Hey mom, I need you to check the mom van. Like, did it fall out? Like, I need you to find my brother's old white t-shirt. Maybe we can duct tape a number on the back of it." Like, it doesn't matter that it's made by the same company. Doesn't matter it's got the same number. Doesn't matter if it has the same logo here. If it's not the right color, you don't get playing time. And if you don't have it, your team is frustrated, the parents are frustrated, you're frustrated, the coach is frustrated. It is an awful experience if you don't have it. And when I read this section of scripture in which the guy didn't have the right clothes, it feels like an honest mistake. It feels like he might have been rushed in the morning and just forgot to pack, the backup wedding clothes you need. Like, you never know when you're gonna be at a wedding, you just always pack them with you. It feels like he forgot that. And so I want the king to extend mercy. I want him to say, "Look, we're gonna find a way for you to be here." And he doesn't, and that doesn't sit well. That feels really confusing. But scholars believe that it wasn't just a mistake. When we look at how this banquet was designed, it was an active act of complacency. You see, what if we change the narrative? What if instead of you having to bring all the right materials, your coach had it there at the field waiting for you? What if he said, I know I coach a bunch of middle school kids, and I know they are unreliable, and I know they're not going to have their stuff together. So for every single game, no matter how far away it is, every single game, I'm going to make sure that everybody's jersey is washed, it is clean, it is ready, and it is already there. And imagine if there's some kid on the team, and you have to wear the alternate jersey. Imagine "No thanks. My eyes just look a lot better in this one, so I'm gonna keep wearing it. It's got the same number. It's made by the same company. It's got your logo here. I just don't really feel like wearing that one." Do you think your coach would let you sit and eat the post-game snacks while everybody's warming up? Do you think he would let you start the next week? No, the guy would be livid. He'd be incredibly disappointed because he extended grace to you. He gave you a way when there was no way, and you didn't take it. He extended the invitation for you, and you rejected it. You rejected the grace. Your coach would honestly probably cut you from the team. Yet we have to go one step further, because putting on the right clothes for this wedding is not just about a fashion statement. It is actually living into the life that God has designed us to live. It's actually a statement of what identity are we going to have. And we use a word to describe this in the church, and it's this word called justification. And justification is this instant act in which God forgives our sins, and we are forgiven, and we are declared righteous. So imagine if you're in a courtroom and you've committed a crime and you are guilty. Justification would be the process of the judge coming down from the bench, taking the handcuffs off of you and putting it on themselves and saying, "You get to walk free." This is the first part. So you get to be forgiven. Your slate is wiped clean. You're free to go. But imagine in that exchange that the judge not only forgave your sin, but he said, "Okay, here are the keys to my car. This is the information to my bank account. This is my social security number. All that I have is now yours." Justification is this process in which we are both forgiven. The slate is wiped clean, but that doesn't mean we have to now earn our way up to God. It's saying that we've already been given that. The righteousness, the right standing of Christ before the Father has now been transferred to us as well. As those who believe that he died and rose for our sins, we don't have to live a life in which we hope we are worthy enough for God. We live a life in which God already looks at you and says, you are enough. We live a life where we are already in right relationship with him, not because we earned it, but because we were freely given it. So to wear these clothes, it is more than a dress code. To wear this jersey is to wear the clothing of righteousness. To wear this is to wear a new identity. To wear this is to say, I believe and I know that God has transformed me. I know that he's made a way and I'm going to live my life differently. This is what is happening here. You see, the clothes represent a life that aligns with our new identity as those who are forgiven and declared righteous. So when this man is given the garment to wear, he doesn't want to be adopted into the family. He rejects it. And what he actually does is he kind of looks at it. He says, okay, logo. Patch. Oof. Patch, okay. Number, let me see here. Number, he tries to take the benefits of grace and apply it to the old garment. He tries to take the benefits of what God can give him and apply it to his life without responding to the invitation to more. You see, this man, he tries to get the peace of Christ without relationship. He wants the provision of Christ without obedience. He wants the love of Christ without connection. He wants the glory of Christ without surrender. He wants grace without the cross. He's trying to keep the pleasure of his old life while gaining the benefits from the new. And he thinks that because he's copying and pasting just a few of the same things that he won't get caught, but he is. And when he is speechless. Because he's confronted with the reality that God is not blind to the condition of his heart. God sees that he's not wearing the right clothes. God sees that he's hiding it. God sees that he is trying to take advantage of his grace. And so on a feast that is supposed to be the good news of many receiving what God has for him, becomes a feast of this man's downfall. It becomes the feast in which his true reality is exposed, and because of that, he is sent to the weeping and gnashing of teeth. He is sent to a place of eternal separation from God, because at the end of the day, this man did not follow God. At the end of the day, this man did not know God. This man was a wedding crasher. This man showed up trying to get some good food and attend an open bar. He didn't want the relationship. He didn't want to respond to grace. All he wanted was the good things that he could cheaply earn from it. And this is the reality of grace. This is the tension. That while it is a beautiful invitation, it's only beautiful if we respond. Yet God gives us the choice of how we respond. We see that everyone is invited to the feast, but only those who are willing to be transformed by grace stay at the feast. And man, when I played soccer, I'm going to be honest with you, I did not enjoy playing for this team. I had a couple of really good coaches, but this was a team where I had awful coaches. I had a coach who was incredibly overweight, and he would make us do like Army basic training drills while he sat on a 5-gallon bucket eating a McDonald's Big Mac and cussing us out because we weren't running fast enough. Like that was the reality that I lived with. And for a couple of years that I played, wearing this jersey felt like putting on a 20-pound weight. Because for this coach, I was never enough. For this coach, everything I did was awful, and I could never read his mind. He would never tell me what I did wrong, but he would always make it very clear that I would never be enough, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how hard I tried. And game after game, I lived with the reality that I was inadequate. And for a really long time, that's what it felt like to follow Jesus for me. Following Jesus felt like I had a list of rules and expectations that I couldn't live up to. Following Jesus felt like I had this weight I had to carry around in which I could never be enough for God because I was always going to fail. But God changed that story. Grace rewrites that narrative because what grace does is that grace calls us worthy. Before you even existed, God called you worthy. Before you even had a breath, God called you worthy. You are not someone made worthy by the products you produce, but you are made worthy by the fact that you were created by a loving God. You are called worthy because he is the one who has given you that name, and it cannot be changed. And when we choose to walk in grace, yes, it calls us to a life in which we make some adjustments. It calls us to a life of day-by-day, momentarily obedience. But the beautiful thing about grace is that it actually transforms our hearts and it transforms our desires. There's a theologian, and he says that grace refashions what sinners love. And so when I played soccer, man, I did not love my coach. I did not love my team. I did not love what I was doing. It felt like a burden. And sometimes when we follow Jesus, it feels like that. But what we don't see behind the scenes is that grace is actually working in our life to create a new love for God. Grace is working behind the scenes in our life to help us love going to the quiet place, to help us love maybe those 15 minutes in the morning where you got to wake up a little bit earlier, where you sit and you rest in God's presence. Grace cultivates in us the desire to maybe have to leave the group of friends we don't want to leave, to maybe leave or change the channel on influences that are just not great for us. Grace cultivates a desire for us to want to wear this. And when this happens, this doesn't become a yoke of burden. This becomes a yoke of freedom because you're living in how God has designed you to live. This isn't a yoke that weighs you down. It is a yoke that helps you run faster and to live a life where you're not constantly looking around trying to check and make sure if you performed well enough, but you get to be confident that you always are enough. And this is the beauty of grace, and this is the beauty of what Jesus is proclaiming, that everyone is invited to the feast, and there's an invitation for more, but you have to be the one that responds to it. And so I'm going to leave you with a question tonight. We get to choose how we respond to grace. The question is, what will you choose? Will you guys pray with me?